Now, problem 291 is a pattern we've solved several times before. It's a problem related to frame rate. This problem asks you to choose the option that does not cause a decrease in frame rate when the parameter in the choices is adjusted. The correct answer is option C. Yes, an increase in gain control is not directly related to frame rate, as you can see. Now, moving on, let's look at problem 292. If you look at the question, it explains that the scanning depth has increased. As a result, it states that the ambiguity of distance here is automatically reduced. The question may seem a bit complicated, but the concept being asked is actually just one. Basically, the depth has increased. This means that the PRF has decreased by that much. That's because as the distance increases, the time it takes to go back and forth also increases. First of all, we can choose C as the correct answer. Let me briefly explain how the decrease in PRF here is related to distance ambiguity. First, when a pulse goes out and returns, you can determine the position of a reflector. However, if the pulse repetition frequency, or PRF, increases, the number of pulses being emitted will also increase. When this happens, it becomes difficult to know exactly which pulse has returned, so there is ambiguity about the exact distance. This is what this concept refers to. In other words, to put it simply, if you excessively increase the PRF and there are too many pulses, it becomes ambiguous to distinguish which pulse has actually been reflected and returned. You just need to remember this basic concept. Next, let's move on and look at question number 293. For this question, you just need to pay attention to the latter part of the sentence. It asks how a B-mode image is displayed. The correct answer is to choose option C. You just need to understand that the term bright dot is associated with B-mode. The next questions, number 294 and 295, follow the same pattern. Let's go ahead and find the correct answers right away. In A mode, the A stands for amplitude, which corresponds to option D. In M mode, the M stands for motion, which corresponds to option A, so please remember that. Next, let's move on and look at question number 296. For this question, you just need to understand the content for reference. It asks which component is essential in a real-time B-mode scanner but does not appear in A mode. To summarize, in the case of B mode, a specific image is produced. Images of organs like the liver or kidneys are created, whereas in A mode, only the specific waveform that goes out and returns is recorded. So, the biggest difference between these two is whether an image is produced or only the signal is recorded. That's the key distinction. The correct answer here would be option D. In the case of a scan converter, since it is related to creating and displaying images, it is an essential component in B mode. On the other hand, in A mode, since only waveforms are recorded, I can explain that a scan converter is not present. As a reference, when comparing A mode and B mode, questions like this may appear, so make sure you understand the content. Let's move on and look at the next question. Starting from here, the questions we'll solve are related to how display images are generated in the equipment. Although this doesn't account for a large portion, there are a few recurring question patterns, so I'll emphasize the important points as we go through this. For question 297, there is an error in the explanation, so we'll skip it. Let's start from question 298. If you look at the question, it asks about the typical frame rate of a television. For reference, you just need to check the correct answer. Just remember that the answer is about 30, which is option C. Next, let's move on to question 299. For this question, let's try to solve it easily by using related keywords. The first keyword you should note is the phrase shade of gray. When you see this kind of content, the most directly related term is bit, which is option B. So, when you see this kind of phrase, you should associate it most closely with the keyword bit. Additionally, a third keyword that might appear is contrast resolution, which refers to the ability to distinguish differences in contrast. This is also related to devices, but rather than delving too deeply, I want to emphasize that it's more efficient to focus on organizing the related keywords. When you encounter these kinds of terms, just pay attention to the associated keywords and choose the correct answer. Now let's move on and take a look at question number 300. If you look at the question, it is asking about related terminology. It is asking which type of resolution evaluates and compares the echogenicity of closely positioned structural objects. It is evaluated through the echogenicity of similar closely positioned structures. You can see this as a sentence referring to contrast resolution, in other words, contrast detectability. It means that the evaluation is based on the differences in echogenicity. Please remember once again that the expressions here are related to terms like shade of gray or bit, as you saw earlier. With this, we've solved up to question 300.